You're listening to episode 104 of the D6 podcast.
I don't know anything more important in our society or in the kingdom of God than to help the church, help the family.
Discipleship is not an event, it's a way of life.
And one day it just hit me that discipleship at home was not about doing more. It was about inviting Christ into what we were already doing.
The goal of family ministry is not families sitting on the couch holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The ultimate goal is families that love God, love people, and make disciples of all peoples.
So that's why you're here. You're here to say 1 hour a week, as significant and as awesome as it is, we know that it's not enough and we want to be intentional with every hour.
You're listening to the D6 podcast. Here's your hosts, Ron Hunter and Jeremy Lee.
This is the family ministry podcast that helps you connect church and home. Hope you guys are doing great this week. We've got some awesome content for you. Sean McDowell is an apologist, and I'm going to throw questions at him like, how can you know heaven is real? Why is there so much violence in the Old Testament? Do miracles still happen today? On and on. I'm going to throw stuff at him that makes other people's heads spin, and he laughs at it. He's going to give you great answers. And this is going to be the episode, by the way. There's going to be this one and next week will be ones that you could mark and say, hey, let's forward this link on to our parents, because parents will enjoy kind of having a reference point for these answers. So when the kids ask them, they can be like, hey, I've heard that before. And they can go back, get the answer, and help their kids get some knowledge in these areas. We're also going to be talking to Tammy Daughtry. Amazing. She does amazing work with families who've gone through divorce, blended families, and things like that. But today, right now, I have Dr. Ron Hunter, who and you're not going to talk to me during the breaks anymore because I'm going to start, but he just told me that in the D6 Randall House building, you did all the plumbing during the remodel. You've climbed under the crawl space.
I am not going to talk to you. Yeah, we did a remodel, and we had
important people know this about you.
This is crazy. We had some old pipes in there, and I had to crawl through the crawl space and reroute a couple of the pipes. And I did plumbing when I was in college. I worked for a plumber. And so, it's basic stuff you just don't forget. So
yeah, it's not basic. Trust me. But
that's the way I feel about electricity. My dad's an electrician, and he's tried to teach me, and I can't seem to learn electricity to save my life.
Okay, I want to play a game real quick.
Okay.
I had an interesting job in seminary too.
Yes.
So I want you to guess it.
Okay. Oh my word.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay, you're going to give me multiple choice.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Good.
A, I made donuts every morning. B, I was a lumberjack and I cut down trees. And C, I was a radio disc jockey.
Oh man, those are tough choices because
it's not, the whole point here is to have a little fun. You have the physique, the beard for a lumberjack, and a donut maker.
You certainly
and a donut maker.
I wasn't going there.
It's okay.
And you got the voice of the radio DJ guy. I would go radio DJ.
Radio DJ. That's your final answer?
That's my final answer. Do I need to phone a friend?
I was a lumberjack.
No
I cut
way.
trees down for a living during seminary.
Really?
Yes.
Where were you?
I could not believe they let people like me cut down trees. They were huge trees. We could have killed ourselves and many others. And
my goodness.
At the seminary, they had these things called blue shirts, and I worked for the blue shirts, the landscaping crew, and somehow they put me on the crew that cut down trees. I've not cut down a tree since then. Trust me, you don't want me cutting down your trees.
Wow.
All right, that's enough of that.
Okay. Let's get back.
I think we've done a decent opening.
We have a new question for Sean McDowell now, don't we?
Why do they let crazy people cut down trees?
I bet he doesn't have an answer for that one. We'll stump him. No pun intended.
The topic today is helping parents answer tough questions. Sean McDowell, you are going to love this guy. He was with us after the break. We'll see you then.
D6 Curriculum is a comprehensive discipleship strategy for all ages in your church. Solid biblical content teaches wise decision-making, and the curriculum emphasizes a biblical worldview. Each quarter of D6 curriculum contains 3 studies, 1 Old Testament, 1 New Testament, and 1 special topic study addressing cultural issues, apologetics, and Christian living. D6 is great for use in life group, small group, or Sunday school. D6 curriculum is affordable and easy to use. You can order teaching materials in print or digital format. See how D6 curriculum gets every age on the same page at d6family.com.
Our guest today is Dr. Sean McDowell. He's a gifted communicator with a passion for equipping the church and in particular young people to make the case for the Christian faith. He also has an amazing t-shirt. Can you look at that. The superheroes with that. I mean, t-shirt of the day. You win that prize, my friend.
Kind of fun.
He connects with audiences in a tangible way through humor and stories while imparting hard evidence and logical support for viewing all areas of life through a biblical worldview. Sean is an associate professor in Christian Apologetics program at Biola University. Thanks for being with us, sir.
Oh, happy to do it. This is a privilege.
Yeah, it's been fun to have you at D6. You are going to be talking today to age-graded ministers. I want to make sure you know that. Youth ministers, children's ministers, they're going to be the ones listening. And they're working hard to help parents move past their fears and insecurities of leading their kids spiritually. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that shuts parents down is that they're afraid that their kids have these tough questions and they don't know what to do with them. So how can we help them with that?
That's a great question. I'm a parent of 3 kids. My son is 13. I have a daughter who's 10, and then I have a son who's 5.
Wow.
And already they've asked me some tough questions, and I have a PhD in apologetics, so I can understand how other parents, maybe with not that training, would feel overwhelmed. A couple things I think we can do. Number one is I want to tell most parents you don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes we build up this pressure like I have to give my kid a perfect answer or it's going to rock their faith. I don't think our kids expect us to have all the answers. They expect us to be real. They expect us to be willing to listen. In fact, when kids ask tough questions, the first response, whether we know or not, should be, "That's a great question. Good for you for thinking like that. Way to go." Yeah. So kids just learn that questions are okay and they're welcome and they're a part of the Christian faith. The second thing that parents can do is the more that we study and we learn and we just love God with our minds, understand why we believe what we believe, then there's a natural confidence that comes with that and takes away some of the fear that often happens when our kid asks us tough questions.
And isn't it acceptable to say, "I don't know, let's find out"?
Never. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. Yes, I say that frequently. Believe it or not, this is what I do. I'll say, "God, that's a good question." My dad often told me, he said, "It's okay to get stumped once, but don't get stumped twice."
Nice.
Then go find the answer. Even if a kid's asking a question, you might say, "Gosh, I don't know, but let's find out together." What a great opportunity.
Perfect. What I thought would be fun for us is if we went through some topics that are typically stuff parents are struggling with, and maybe go ahead and give them some words. I think one of the greatest things we can do for parents sometimes is just give them some words, help them get started. Sure. But before we do, why do you think the parents fear these kind of questions? How can they overcome the fear?
I think the best thing is to just realize that they don't have all the answers and that there's a lot of really smart people who have gone before them. I've done this about 2 decades in apologetics. My father's done it over 5. And this is true for me, but I asked my dad, I was like, "When's the last time you heard a new question?" And he said, "Very rarely." Wow. It might be a new spin on a certain question, but really, essentially, it's a lot of the same questions. So just knowing there's an answer, if I'm willing to go find it, takes away a lot of the fear of having to be the expert.
Wow. All right, well then let's dive in. If my kid comes to me at bedtime and goes, "Dad, how can I know heaven is real?" What do I need to say to him?
So let me qualify one more thing. When kids ask questions, the first thing I do is I want to affirm that it's a great question. And I might say, "Wow, what got you thinking about that?"
Nice, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I want to know where it's coming from that a kid is asking a question about heaven. Now, it might be they go, "Gosh, I was just thinking about, I heard some at heaven, want to know if there's evidence." Good, give them an answer. It could be they go, "Well, my friend's grandpa died." Could be my friend's mom got cancer. There could be something beneath it. So oftentimes with kids and young people, instead of launching into an answer, I often want to find out if there's a question beneath the question.
Nice. Yeah, that's great.
So with that said, here's what I would say. There was a movie in the 1980s called Flatliners. It had Julia Roberts, Oliver Platt, Kevin Bacon, Kiefer Sutherland, and they were medical students, and they wanted to know if there's life after death. Instead of studying philosophy or religion, what they do is they flatline each other's hearts, and then they bring them back from the dead and ask them what's on the other side. Now, it's a morbid experiment. Please don't do this at home. And I'm not recommending people see the movie, but the thinking is, if you want to know if heaven is real, talk to someone who's been there and who can come back and tell us about it. Well, Jesus didn't die 30 seconds or 5 minutes like in that movie. He died. He was really fully dead. As we know, even the Roman centurion confirms, he comes back on the third day. And it says in the gospel, John chapter 14, he says to his apostles, I'm going to prepare a place for you. So I would just say to a kid, I'd say if Jesus really predicted that he would die, he was buried 3 days, he came back and told us that heaven is real, then that's someone who's been there and can confirm that heaven is real. Now, there are stories of kids and other people who've gone there. I think they have some value, but I ultimately want a kid to ground his or her faith in the scriptures and the truth of the scriptures more so than somebody's experience outside of the scriptures. Those support it, and those are wonderful, but let's bring it back to the person of Jesus. If he died and rose from the grave, then heaven actually exists.
He's the eyewitness.
He is the eyewitness.
Okay, so let's bring another question. Why is there, and this one is one I've asked, so I want to hear this from you. Why is there so much violence in the Old Testament?
Yeah, this is a great question. One reason there's so much violence in the Old Testament is because the Old Testament is a very realistic book. It's a realistic book. The Bible doesn't kind of cloud over the depravity and sickness of mankind. It's not a fairy tale. And Romans 3 describes how human beings, Paul paints this picture of human beings known as good, not one. Their mouths are like the venom of asps. We are profoundly and deeply corrupted and broken as human beings. It's not just in the Old Testament. Look in the 20th century. Human beings are fallen. So you look in the book of Judges, and what do you see? Over and over again, it's repeated, and people did what was right in their own eyes. So why is there so much violence in that book? It's showing here's what's happened when people walk away from God. Here's what happens when people become their own judges. It results in death and bloodshed and violence. Now, sometimes in light of that, because God is holy and because God is just, he does step in and judge and correct at times. He doesn't all the time, but because he was preparing for a holy people, the nation of Israel, through whom his son would be born, there were times that God needed to protect that nation and also to bring justice. So ultimately there's violence because we're dealing with a sinful, broken people. God is ultimately ushering in justice through the birth of his son, Jesus Christ.
There you go. Great job. Were there books that were left out of the Bible? Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's an important one. Let's focus in particular and say the Gospels, because Old Testament, New Testament, those are really distinct questions. So in the Gospels, we've heard in the Da Vinci Code, which is over a decade now, but you still see it lingering in culture, that there were 80-some Gospels in the first century. And through this conspiracy, somehow Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got put in the canon, and these other Gospels and New Testament books were left out. Well, that makes for a good novel, but historically speaking, there's very little, in fact, I would say essentially no good reason to think that any of these other so-called Gospels, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, have more credibility historically than the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we know pretty much beyond a shadow of a doubt that all four Gospels were written within the century in which Jesus lived. Well, there were still eyewitnesses alive who could report the things that they had seen. Or in the case of Luke, in Luke 1, he carefully investigated everything. Well, these other Gospels start showing up in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So they're interesting in terms of what people believed after the time of the Gospels. But there's no good reason to think that they have more historical credibility, let alone are inspired. You don't see the early church fathers quoting Thomas, quoting Philip as if they're inspired. but you see him quoting the canonical Gospels. So other books show up, but I don't think there's good reason to think that somehow books were left out and there's this big conspiracy and people are covering up the real Jesus.
Yeah. Those other Gospels have some interesting stories about Jesus, don't they?
They do. They're very interesting stories.
I remember one where he zapped somebody. They were making fun of him, and he zapped some. Anyway, good reading. Do miracles still happen today?
They do. Miracles still happen today. And I believe that with deep confidence. Now, does that mean God answers all of our prayers about miracles? No. But he didn't in the Old Testament, New Testament times either. There's a massive volume that if somebody has doubts and questions about God doing miracles today, I would encourage them to check out probably one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world. His name is Craig Keener, Keener. And he is first-rate, careful scholar, one of the best. And he did a 2-volume academic series. We're talking, 800-900 pages between the two of them, where he goes and documents from really the beginning of history, but then focuses on present time, looking at claims of miracles, asking, is there credibility that miracles still happen? And he has a few conclusions. Number one, he says the same kinds of miracles that we see in the New Testament, people being healed who are blind, people, even a few instances of people rising from the dead. He says these New Testament kinds of miracles, demons being cast out, there are massive amounts of reports of those today. Second, he says tens of millions. And let me say that again to make it sink in. He actually says 100 million, but if you're going to be conservative, tens of millions of Christians alive today believe they have personally experienced the miraculous or seen it. Not just a story from somebody else, but they have personally seen and experienced it. Now he says some of these are better attested than others, but he lists story after story, decade after decade, state after state, country after country, carefully documented instances of the miraculous. So it's not just blind faith, as a critic would say, it's from a book 2,000 years ago. And I'm not saying God does always answer our prayers and does every single miracle. But there is very good reason to believe that the miraculous still happens today.
Does Jesus promise us whatever we ask for in prayer?
Yeah, that's great.
I could see a kid asking that, yeah.
Well, so you look in the book of John, and he essentially says to his apostles, whatever you ask for in my name, you shall have. And I've heard so many people say, my goodness, you ask for a house, you ask for a job, you ask for a spouse, you name it, God will give it to you. I asked for it, God didn't give it to me, therefore Jesus is a false prophet. Well, the question when we see a statement like this is, let's go back to the context, let's look at the passage, and let's see what Jesus is actually promising. He's not giving this blanket American materialistic, have whatever you want. First, he's saying, if you abide in me, this is John 15, and I in you, then God is going to begin to transform us from the inside out, including our desires. So what happens is if we truly abide in Christ and live for him, then our wants will become his wants. And necessarily, we will get what we ask for in prayer insofar as it's aligned with his wants. So this is not about us getting whatever we want. It's actually the reverse. It's actually meant to get us to say, what is it that you want? What does that reveal about your heart? And have you first submitted your heart to what God wants first? That's a very different way of thinking about it.
Okay, so no cosmic blank check. So I'll have to get rid of that.
Definitely not. I mean, we just know that because you look in the rest of the Bible and you have promises of people that will suffer. We have promises. Peter says people will suffer. We have Paul asking for his thorn to be taken away, and it's not. So if it didn't happen with Paul, clearly this isn't a blanket statement for the rest of us.
Well, that leads us to the next one, especially with all that's going on with the storms and all the different things we have seen recently, and even the threats of nuclear war and all that. It just feels like there's so much suffering in the world. Why doesn't God stop suffering? If he can, why doesn't he do it?
You know what, Jeremy, this is the classic age-old question.
It is.
Whenever I see an individual act of suffering, For example, Nabil Qureshi, just the great Christian apologist who passed away this past week. People ask me, why did God allow him to suffer? Why didn't he heal him? My answer is, I don't know. And I could never know. None of us could know unless God specifically told us. But as we look in scriptures, we know a few things. We know, one, that this world is profoundly and deeply broken. That sin has affected all of us from the inside out, even creation groans. So until Jesus comes back, we're going to suffer. That's the way it works. In fact, 1 Peter 3:17 says it's God's will that we should suffer at times. Now, why would it be God's will? Well, one reason is God is less interested in our comfort than he is in our salvation, and he is in our character. Now, that strikes us as difficult to hear in a world in which you're hungry, you just call pizza, you got a headache, take a Tylenol. I mean, the world is oriented to meet our instant needs. And God is like, no, I'm more interested in your deeper character, who you are, and eternal life than your comfort. Second, I actually think, and I really believe that God uses our sufferings as Christians to draw people to the faith. So you look at one of the great scientists of our day, Francis Collins, was an atheist. And he was working in hospice and medical school. And he just said these Christians who were dying had a peace in their life. And he just kept wondering, what's the source of this peace? It got to him. Goes and reads Mere Christianity, becomes a Christian. So God used the suffering of believers, that they saw there's something besides this world, that God was present with them, as difficult as it was, that there's still eternal life, to draw people to him. So I can't answer why an individual person suffers in any instance. It could be something we do. There could be a divine plan going on. I simply don't know. But I know God is good. And I know God uses our sufferings ultimately for good. And he wants us to trust him. And I also know that God is not distant in our sufferings. We don't worship a God who just sent us a book or an angel or a prophet. We follow a God who has personally suffered and spared no expense, sending his own son to die on our behalf. This is a God who says, I'm with you and I understand, and someday I will ultimately redeem it for good.
Great job. See, now ministers who are listening to this, you can rack this tape, set it aside, and when parents come and say, oh man, my kid asked these questions, you can just say, I got something for you, and send it over to them. And also in a second, we're going to give them a book, right, that they can put in their hands. But before we get to that, it is true. You've mentioned your dad a couple of times. His name's Josh McDowell. I think a lot of people would know. He's had a great legacy as an apologist and author. Now, obviously, you're sitting here. You've kind of followed in the footsteps. He's passed down faith to you. Mm-hmm. So we're at D6. This is what we're talking about. I think people would like to hear kind of some inside behind the scenes of how did he do it? And also, I think I would like to add, he's not a perfect. So, were there times where he wasn't perfect at it? Sure. I think it would probably relieve some people to hear that. If Josh McDowell screws up, then I guess I can a little bit too.
Oh, my dad would be the first one to say he's not perfect. Mm-hmm. He doesn't pretend or even claim to be perfect, which is one thing that always, I think, endeared me to him in the faith, is when you see him on stage, you see him in public, he's the same way, full of energy, full of passion, loves people, loves truth. So it never felt a disconnect to me. I really saw him and my mom live out their faith in a way that was not perfect, but in a way that was attractive and meaningful and had integrity. That was a big draw to me. Another thing is my parents worked really hard to have a relationship with me. They just went to my games. They would take me to my friends. We would go on vacations. We just did the family stuff, and that relationship was there. So the older I get, the more and more I see people just walking away from the faith because it's rules, it's regulations, it's legalism, and there's no relationship. My parents certainly had rules. They certainly had standards, and sometimes we pushed back against it. But I always knew deep in my gut, even though I didn't want to admit it sometimes, okay, I know my parents love me, and they have the best for me. All right, I probably should listen. Not that I always did, but that voice was there. So it was love. It was in a relationship. And why am I in the world of apologetics? I don't ever remember my dad saying, son, you should be an apologist. You should write a book. I don't ever remember him saying that. I just remember him saying, son, whatever you do, be your best, honor God, and advance the kingdom. That's it. Just be the person God has made you to be. And I think that freed me up as I started to have my own questions, as I started to realize, gosh, I do have some of the same abilities and heart that my father has, and this is a wonderful opportunity in my life, that it freed me to fall out without the pressure that a lot of kids in a similar circumstance can feel.
Yeah. Well, okay, you guys have just re-released, you've updated the Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and that book has made a big impact. When was it first published?
It was first published in 1972.
Jeez Louise, that's older than me.
40.
I thought I was old.
Me too. I wasn't born yet.
Yeah. But you've updated. Talk about how you've updated it, and
Sure.
And share with a whole new generation of ministers how it could be helpful.
So the reason we updated it, a few reasons. Number one is the questions have changed.
Yeah,
there's some There's some of the core questions: is the Bible true? Did Jesus rise from the grave? That people will always be asking, and we always need evidence for them. So we took that core content from Evidence and updated it, responded to objections, and just made it as relevant and timely for today. But there also is a lot of new questions people are asking. Questions like the one you asked me earlier: are there other hidden gospels that were not in the Bible? That's become a big question since the last release of Evidence. A huge question: is Christianity just a copycat religion that's copied after Adonis and Mithras and Horus and Isis and all these different pagan mythical deities? So we added a chapter on that. I had a chapter on the fate of the apostles. What really happened to Peter and Paul and James? Did they die as martyrs for their faith? And is this good evidence for the Christian faith? So there's just been new questions critics ask, but there's also a lot new evidence that we've included into it. So we've also carefully gone through just the tone of it. And the tone, my dad's always had a gracious tone, but we live in such a us against them, vitriolic culture that we went painstakingly careful through to make sure it was as gracious and commendable as possible. So people would read it and say, wow, that's convincing evidence, but they feel respected, they feel cared for in a relational manner, as much as you can do that in an apologetics book. So that was just a kind of a care that we applied to it. It was a lot of work, as much, probably next to my dissertation, the most work on any project I've ever done.
I can imagine.
But I guess the last reason we updated is this. Think about it this way. When Evidence first came out, what made that book so powerful is nobody had access to that information. It was the first time some people thought there's evidence for the resurrection. There's evidence from prophecy. People didn't have access to it. Well, you might be thinking, wait a minute, now there's tons of information. Why is this still valuable? Well, two reasons. Number one is one of the greatest commodities in our world today is trust. When everybody has a voice, is there a voice that I can trust? And the book of Evidence, and my father doing this for 50 years, has really built some trust that the church and other people know he's going to do good work. And then second, it saves time. I mean, the information's out there. You want to spend months researching it, go for it. But if you want one volume that says, here's the evidence on the key events through the Bible, how we know it's true, it'll save you a ton of time.
You're like an information concierge. You're just doing it for us, handing it to us.
Totally. That's a way to think about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. You guys, his website is SeanMcDowell.org. And you can go there to learn more about the new updated version of Evidence That Demands a Verdict. You can also, there's blogs on there. There's a lot of neat resources. You got, I think, some podcasts or some videos. I've seen some videos. And it is a great place for you to go if you're looking for some answers. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Jeremy.
What if you could multiply your ministry 168 times over? We have a way for you to do that today. We believe that true discipleship is attained through diligently studying God's Word and applying the Scriptures to your daily life. Spending 1 hour each week out of 168 in a worship service is simply not enough. D6 devotional study guides are here to help. Each week, everyone in your family studies the same theme, with lessons and devotions appropriate to each age level. Moms and dads will love the devotions and articles as conversation starters. Children will love reading and playing games in their own devotional study guide. Families will love spending time together during the week discussing and studying the scriptures. To learn more about the D6 devotional magazines, you can go to d6family.com/D6curriculum.
You know, I'm going to echo what Jeremy said earlier. When you get a chance to hear Sean talk about these questions, especially one that Jeremy didn't kind of promote earlier, why doesn't God stop suffering? Every teenager asks that question. You know, why doesn't Jesus answer every prayer we give? Those are questions every teenager's here. So if you're a student minister listening, man, send this podcast right on out. And I'll tell you something else. A lot of the kids in your student ministry could also benefit from our second guest, which is Tammy. Share with our listeners how you connected with Tammy and what stands out in your mind.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was at a conference. I was working in a booth and just chatting up. You know, when you're in a booth, you just chat up. You're like, you know, I'm naturally an introvert, but I have to be extroverted in that booth. And
You're not naturally. I love that.
We're going to talk about that later because I am, Ron.
That's like you claiming that I'm a boomer. Yeah, I love it. I love it. I am not, and you are not. Okay, we'll go on.
Oh, okay. I'm an introverted lumberjack, and you can't say different. All right. So
new mental images.
Tammy Daughtry came by, just, you know, and I thought she was a minister or something like that, and she just started talking to me, and I quickly realized she's an author, a counselor, has a foundation, starts working with, and I'm like starting to just be blown away by this lady. She's the one who introduced the term co-parenting to me. I actually had never heard that term. I think it's a genius way to kind of use a little bit more of a peaceful term that usually takes place in more chaotic scenarios. So I think co-parenting and this whole topic, and Tammy just blew me away. I've interviewed her before as well. She's fabulous. I love Tammy. Thanks, Tammy, for being here. Let's listen in to Tammy Daughtry talk about co-parenting.
We're sitting with Tammy Daughtry, and man, I tell you what, when I got a chance to meet her and her husband Jay, we went out and we had lunch together and we learned, and I think our listeners know I'm a child of divorce. And so when I speak to somebody like Tammy and Jay or Ron Deal, who actually introduced us, Tammy, it was a breath of fresh air to hear how you are ministering to kids who are from broken homes. And so I want to give people a little bit of background over who you are, and then we're going to jump into some of the discussion that we had over the dinner table that day, talking together. So first, welcome to the broadcast, Tammy.
Thank you so much, Ron. It's an honor to be here.
Your credentials are impressive. You have founded an organization called Co-Parenting International. You're a marriage and family therapist. You have written a book called Co-Parenting Works, Helping Kids Thrive After Divorce. You have 4 kids yourself. You have 2 son-in-laws. You have 2 grandkids and 1 on the way. I think you know a little bit about this area.
Yeah, well, we did. We blended our family about 9 years ago, and I was actually a single mom for 8.5 years, so I am also a co-parent. Been doing that for 17 years of the youngest daughter's life. So I'm walking right alongside all the families that we're trying to help.
Well, for our listeners, I've seen the resources that she and Jay have worked on, and they are absolutely rich. They're deep. They're thorough. They're based upon research, not on opinion, and they can be trusted. So you need to dive deeper into this as you, and I don't say if, you are ministering to blended families, and you need to contextualize that. So Tammy, here's your first question. When we met over the table that day and we were sharing a wonderful meal, you talked about 5 categories of co-parenting. Tell our listeners about the ugly one.
Well, the ugliest of those 5, I would say, is what we call fiery foes. And those are co-parents who, they may not interact very much, but when they do, it's kind of like a landmine goes off. And it can be, at a transition on, leaving mom's house, going to dad's. It can be at a school function, out in the parking lot. It can be in a variety of ways. But those fiery foes, they really stay in that battle, even 5-10 years post-divorce, and they're really struggling to communicate well. So that's really where people usually start.
So help them identify how can they recognize it? You said there's a landmine goes off, but there are people who are in denial. How do they recognize that they're in the fiery foes?
Well, if they're changing kids over the weekend or every other week and not making eye contact, if they're not able to speak, just small talk at those transitions or small talk in the lobby while they're, waiting for their child to come off the stage or off the ball field. If they intentionally find themselves feeling high anxiety every time they know they're going to see that person, and especially if they're planning ahead for how they're going to get back at them, and it's been 3 to 5 to 10 years later, they're probably stuck in that fiery foe category.
So hopefully then we would begin to recognize or help the parents who are in that fiery foe recognize if they're being intentionally vindictive or uncomfortably awkward every time they're around their former spouse. So let's talk about a healthy one. Let's jump into a healthy one.
Well, we try to point them to what's called cooperative colleagues. And the analogy I give there, it's kind of like business partners who need to communicate. They make decisions together. They might often be in the same physical space as each other, but they're very mature. They're businesslike. It's not personal. It's just practical and compartmentalized communication.
So businesslike. So here's my thought then. A lot of times the new spouse is jealous or threatened by the other spouse and use the term businesslike. Let's describe that a little bit more so that we can take that edge off and not find threatening issues here.
Sure. Well, and it is common that if a person marrying into co-parents that work well together, that are good cooperative colleagues, it might feel a little weird if you're the new step-parent, because I think society in general assumes people get divorced and they're going to hate each other and they're going to be very blunt and outgoing about that. But the hard news is that when parents stay angry like that, it hurts kids. And when parents can turn the corner and find a way to be cooperative and to be businesslike, then kids actually have the freedom to thrive between both homes. But marrying into that, or if you're dating someone who has children with a former spouse, it can be very uncomfortable for the new step-parent to recognize, wow, my new husband actually gets along with his ex-wife, or my new wife actually speaks respectfully of her ex-husband. It kind of flips it on its head as far as what society is used to. But the reason we point people towards that kind of healthy communication is it's all about the kids. It's giving the children the freedom to have a healthy childhood. We always talk about the 4 words. It's one heart, 2 homes. Kids in co-parented families, whether they're single-parent families, step-families, they're living with one heart between 2 homes. And everything those parents can do to keep that heart whole will help that child thrive. And that's the goal. The goal is to be cooperative, to be businesslike and respectful, really because you love your child. Not because you care about the former spouse, but because you really love your child and you want to give them the most healthy childhood possible.
So let's talk to the person who is operating in this cooperative colleagues, this businesslike, this respectful relationship. It doesn't always stay that way. In fact, when we were meeting over lunch, you kind of got a little vulnerable and you talked about hitting a landmine. Can you go back and share any stories that while you're working and operating in a healthy time that you realize, I've kind of moved back into an unhealthy territory, whatever it is. It might not be the fiery foe, it might be a different area, but help us recognize that people aren't always walking perfectly and how to identify when we hit one of those mines.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I can tell you, personally, I've been co-parenting now, like I said, for 17 years, and we did really great the first 4 or 5 years. Neither of us were remarried. And when our daughter was 5, her dad was getting engaged and getting married, and I was actually very happy for that. I'll tell you, the moment for me, it wasn't conflictual, but it was emotional, is that when we did an exchange and my daughter walked away holding hands with her new stepmom, stepmom had her backpack on one shoulder and hold my little girl's hand on the other. And then she came back that weekend with painted fingernails and all these fun stories about her new stepmom. I was thrilled that her new stepmom was going to love her, but it was an emotional moment to realize, wow, there's another woman in my daughter's life. And I have a choice if I'm going to celebrate that and stay focused on what's good for my daughter, or if I'm going to let it trigger fear or territorial thinking. And thankfully, I responded well, and I said, Lord, thank you for a woman who loves my daughter. And over these years, I've actually really tried to initiate good communication with her because she's a very important part of our co-parent team.
Yeah.
She's as important to my daughter as her dad is because their relationship will impact my daughter's life. And so not only have I tried to respect my daughter's father, but always respect her new stepmother and to applaud that relationship and be very intentional to tell my daughter how much I appreciate her stepmom in her life.
Wow. You know, I have a feeling that 8 out of 10 times it goes the other way, and that territorial or competitive spirit kind of rises up. So let's tell people, because we're having a 10-minute therapy session here for our listeners, but the truth is they need a lot longer. They can obviously go to Amazon and pick up your book, Co-Parenting Works, Helping Kids Thrive After Divorce. Where else would you send them? What else? You've got other tools too.
Sure.
So tell them about your website, what can happen, and where they can go to get more.
Sure. Well, our website is coparentinginternational.com. There's some free downloads on there. There's the top 10 things kids of divorce wish they could say to their parents. There's some parenting resources there. And then one that we're really proud of is our digital curriculum. And it can be used, parents can go through it personally. Leaders can take others through it at their church, and it's called One Heart, Two Homes, Co-Parenting Kids of Divorce to a Positive Future. It's a digital resource with a workbook and really, really helpful tool. 33 different people speaking to this topic are on that curriculum.
That's awesome. So I want you to go check out that website, and maybe even you might need to back up this podcast and re-listen to a couple of things Tammy said earlier. And I'm looking forward to having her husband Jay on in a future episode, who we're going to keep this conversation going. And if you want to hear more like this, just keep coming back week after week. Check out Tammy, check out Jay's materials, and dive deeper into their books. Highly recommend it.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Tammy. Once again, great interview. And I'll tell you what, as you heard me say with her, we're going to get a chance to hear from her husband, Jay, next week. And he's going to talk through the 6 risk factors for adult kids of divorce. And I am one of those. I am an adult kid of divorce. And there are a lot of us walking around out there, and Jay gave me some real insight on some of these areas, and he's going to tackle that. And we're going to have Sean's dad back next week.
Yeah, we're not going to use his name.
No.
It's just Sean's dad.
Just Sean's dad. Yeah.
So Sean's dad will be here, some dude.
Yeah.
And but if you like the interview with Sean, it's going to be super similar. I used a very similar format. So there's going to be more of these questions. So you want to probably think about the next 2 episodes like a set, especially because we've got the Daughtries speaking on the topic of divorce and co-parenting. So I love how these are matched together. We'll see you guys next week. It's on Podcast Tuesday. That's what you got to think about. Tuesday, D6 Podcast. Hope you guys have a great week. Enjoy ministry and avoid cutting down trees.
Sounds like Bob Barker, get your cat spayed or neutered.
Can you tag that at the end, please? I think that would be amazing if you just took that pause out and put
just
those
throw that
together.
Mm-hmm. You sound like Bob Barker.
You've been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com. And if you're a minister, we invite you to join the D6 Leader Network by going to d6leader.net.